Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kendra Yoch.
And I'm Amy Dickerson.
Welcome to the 12th webinar in our Franczek Educational Equity Series. Amy and I continue to be your moderators for this, the final session of our monthly series that has been running throughout the year. During the series, we've been exploring how school districts can identify and break down systemic barriers that are depriving students of equitable educational opportunities. Explore how to intentionally allocate resources, which is going to be our focus today, and use the law as a driver for internal reforms to support our most vulnerable student populations. These conversations are not always comfortable, but they're critical to helping to make meaningful and positive change in our public school systems. Today, we'll focus on resources. Inequitable funding impacts educational programming and student outcomes. Illinois has historically had one of the most inequitable distribution of education dollars in the country. In this session, we'll explore how the evidence-based funding formula works and the impact since the legislation passed since 2017. And we're happy to welcome Melissa Figueira of Advance Illinois to help us understand the nuts and bolts of the funding formula. We are also very excited to welcome Dr. Chuck Lane, Superintendent of Centralia High School District, and Dr. Kimako Patterson, Superintendent of Prairie-Hills School District 144, to discuss the impact of the new formula on their districts and their efforts to advance equity. Finally, we will preview some proposed changes to the school funding model that are on the horizon. And so thank you to you all and welcome. And thank you to everyone who is joining us. We're happy to have you here as well. I do want to remind you to submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. That is easier for us to keep track of than the chat. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. So we'll go ahead and get started. And let's start by learning a bit more about our guests. First, we're delighted to have Melissa Figueira from Advance Illinois, which is an independent policy and advocacy organization working towards a healthy public education system that enables students to achieve success in college, career, and civic life. Melissa is a senior policy advisor at Advance Illinois. She was born and raised in Miami, Florida, where the weather must be much nicer. And she attended public schools before moving to New York City, where she earned her master's degree in education policy from Teachers College at Columbia University, with a focus on K-12 education. Prior to joining Advance Illinois, Melissa worked with the Research and Policy Support Group at the New York City Department of Education. So welcome, Melissa. And can you tell us a little bit more about Advance Illinois and your role there?
Absolutely, and thanks, Kendra. And I will say what got me interested in education policy in the first place was volunteering as an art teacher in New York City schools that could not afford to pay full-time art teachers. So the notion of resource equity is really near and dear to my heart. So at Advance Illinois, we really fundamentally believe that all students deserve that equitable access to a high quality education. And as Kendra mentioned, we're a nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization working towards really making that healthy public education system a reality for every single Illinoisan. And we do that working all the way from birth to career, which we sometimes refer to as the B20 approach to education policy. So we're really thinking about equity all the way through kind of a child's life. And when we think about that, we really do try to make sure that in our kind of policy design and advocacy efforts, we're marrying kind of really rigorous data analysis and research with engaging with our communities and school leaders, educators who are actually doing the work on the ground to understand policy problems as they pop up and then design solutions that can really be systemic and lasting. So that's what we try to do at Advance. A lot of our work on funding equity kind of really fits well into that kind of vision of the healthy education system. And I'm super thrilled to be here today with Dr. Lane and Dr. Patterson, who have been kind of fearless champions for that equity work as well. In my role personally, I'm on the policy team at Advance Illinois, so I do a lot of the kind of number crunching, the data analysis to really understand the root causes of problems and then try to design those meaningful policies.
Great there. Thank you for that, Melissa. And so we are also thrilled to have Dr. Patterson and Dr. Lane with us today as well. Dr. Kimako Patterson is Superintendent of Prairie-Hills School District 144, where she has served as superintendent since the 2011 school year. And Dr. Chuck Lane is superintendent at Centralia High School District, where he has been for the last 21 years. So both Dr. Patterson and Dr. Lane have worked on school funding reform issues. And as Melissa mentioned, not only have they worked on those issues during their careers, they have also worked a lot with Advance Illinois. So Dr. Patterson and Dr. Lane, if you can please both tell us briefly about the districts that you currently serve. And Dr. Patterson, if you would like to start.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me and providing me with the privilege of serving on the panel today to discuss something that is also near and dear to my heart. I have the privilege of being superintendent for Prairie-Hills Elementary School District 144. We are located in Southern Cook, Illinois, or in South Cook. We service 4 communities, the communities of Country Club Hills, Hazelcrest, Markham, and Oak Forest. We have 8 schools, 3,000 students, 425 staff members. We have about 82% African American, 15% Hispanic population, and roughly about a 3% Caucasian population. Our socioeconomic status hovers around 87 to 90%. And it remains a pleasure. This is my 11th year, but this is my 19th year in the district. So it remains a pleasure to lead.
Wow, that's great. All right, Dr. Lane, if you'd like to share a little bit about your district with us, please.
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to first thank Advance Illinois and the Franczek Law Firm for inviting me to share some thoughts today. Centralia High School is located in rural Southern Illinois, about 4 hours straight south, down I-57 from Chicago. Our enrollment is somewhere around 875 students with a low-income population of approximately 65%. We have a 20% minority population in our school right now, with around a 15% mobility rate, which is very challenging for us. We are a 9 through 12 school district with 12 feeder schools, some as small as 60 students. So trying to place those students properly from those 12 schools can be a challenge for our guidance counselors. We are heavily invested now in CTE courses, and we are really trying to invest more in career pathway courses that lead to certificates or endorsements.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview. And you know, it's great to hear, and particularly the conversation that we're going to be having today around the funding formula, to have your perspectives, not only given, you know, your different districts, but also given the length of time that each of you have been at your districts, and the perspective that will bring to the discussion is really remarkable. So, you know, Melissa, let's start off. You know, I anticipate that our audience members may have some varying levels of familiarity with evidence-based funding. Some may be very well acquainted with all the details, and others maybe just have a general sense of the changes that have been made. So could you take a moment and walk us through how the evidence-based funding formula works and the impact you have seen since the legislation passed in 2017?
Absolutely. And I'm going to cheat, if it's all right, and pull up some slides, because I feel like a picture is really worth 1,000 words when it comes to especially talking about data. So I'm going to quickly take us on a crash course through how the formula works. And then, as you mentioned, just share some data on how we know it's working and what progress has been made so far. So really at the core of the funding formula is the goal of really trying to close resource equity gaps for Illinois students. So that is what is at the heart of the design of both kind of the first part of the formula, which is understanding what it costs to fully fund schools based on students' individual needs. And then the second part of the formula, which is then distributing state funds in an equitable manner in order to get us to that goal and cover all of those costs. So a quick run through of the formula. The first thing that it does really is to, and the reason it's called evidence-based is because it starts with looking at, you know, studies about what educational inputs really move the needle in terms of student outcomes. So what do we need to invest in as school districts in order to ensure that our students are achieving their highest, in order to increase grad rates, increase proficiency rates, and really kind of set those kids up for college and career success? And there is a robust body of research on the inputs that are able to do that. So starting from that kind of list of best practices and really high quality educational inputs, the formula then costs out what you would need as a district to provide all of those services, supports, staffing positions in each district in Illinois. Now we know that our 850 plus districts all look very different from one another. So in designing those adequacy targets or calculating them out, the evidence-based formula actually calculates a unique target for every single one of the school districts in Illinois that reflects the needs of its demographic population. So it takes into account, the number of English learners that a district serves and the number of students from low-income households that a district serves, and the fact that supports and staffing for those student populations may look different than staffing for others. So the first thing we see on this slide is just a quick visual representation of the fact that those dotted lines show us that every district has a different kind of nominal dollar amount for their adequacy target. Once they reach that, they would ostensibly have what the formula thinks they need to provide a high quality education for kids. But then we know that we already have some funding on the table, right? Districts already have some resources at their disposal. So we need to take into account the local property taxes that are able to go towards funding K-12 public schools. And just in our quick example here, what the formula does is it doesn't assume that all districts are able to do that in a uniform manner. It actually really takes into account the fact that some districts have a lot of local property wealth and can thus provide really kind of most of the resources that their schools need just by relying on their local property tax base, often without even taxing at very high rates. When on the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of districts that have far less property wealth and thus are going to be more heavily reliant on state and federal resources to kind of make up that gap, because even taxing at very high rates, those property poor districts are unable to kind of generate, what they need to reach that adequacy target. So the formula looks first at that kind of local wealth that's available. It then calculates, in addition to that, what state funds districts have at their disposal. And one of the, I think, important provisions in the EVF kind of calculation is that this base funding minimum, or this amount of state funding that schools have available to them, kind of acts as a hold harmless year over year. So as we go forward in time, districts are meant to not lose state funding in this category. It's really intended to be additive or cumulative. So each year that the state puts more funding into schools through the formula, in the following year, that's included in their base funding minimum. So we should really always be making progress towards those adequacy target goals. All right, so once we know your target that you're shooting for as a district, how much you're getting from local and state funding sources, we're left with our gap, and we can really begin to understand what the difference is between the resources a district has and the resources it needs. And what EBF does is then use that information to really drive new state funding every single year that the legislature appropriates new funding to districts in a pretty aggressively equitable fashion. So it sends the most new dollars in any given year to those districts that are furthest from full funding. And there's a whole bunch of complexities about the mechanisms through which these are actually executed, and I could talk about it till the cows come home. But I think an important shorthand to know is that when this money is distributed, our districts are kind of placed into 4 categories or tiers that kind of help us understand where the money is going. And so just so you guys know, for reference, a tier 1 district are those districts that are farthest from full funding. Tier 2 districts are below 90% of their adequacy target. Tier 3 districts are between 90 and 100% of full funding, and tier 4 districts are over 100% of full funding. So really, if you're a tier 1 district, you're going to be getting the most out of the formula because you have the greatest need. And then just a few kind of data points to help us understand how the formula has worked since its passage, now that we understand the mechanics. This chart really just shows the amount of investment that was kind of committed to in the legislation that passed EVF, and that's represented by the orange line. So what that represents is if the state year over year kind of consistently provided $350 million for the evidence-based funding formula, that's the trajectory we would expect towards adequacy. Now that amount is really a minimum, and I think our superintendents can talk about, the fact that we probably need a lot more in order to close the gap to full funding as fast as possible, but at least this provides a way for the state to keep ahead of inflation and make progress towards fully funding the formula. We did flat fund the formula in FY21, so there was no new state funding that flowed in that year, and happily got back on track last year, hoping that we can continue this kind of upwards movement to really fund the formula over time. Another way that we can kind of understand progress with the formula is to look at the percent of adequacy of each district and see how that's changed over time. And one of the kind of really powerful statistics for Advance Illinois has been looking at the change in the number of districts that are below 60% of full funding. So really trying to understand how many districts have kind of moved out of that category or improved in terms of their funding levels. And strikingly, before EBF, there were over 160 districts below 60% of full funding. Since EBF was in place and 3 years of funding flowed through the formula, only a handful of districts, I think it's 14 at this point, remain at that level below 60% of full funding. So that's a huge kind of raising that floor up just with the first 3 years worth of funding. I think important to note, however, that it's kind of a, we've come so far, we've got so far to go story at this point with EBF. We do have over half of Illinois students still in districts funded below 70% of full funding. So our next big goal is really to help those districts get above that 70% line, just as we've done with 60%. The other thing I'll leave us with, and then I'll take off my numbers, is just that one of the things that we really want to try to understand, and since we're talking about equity today, is what are the gaps in funding between where students are and where they should be on average for different student groups. The formula allows us to kind of compare those things, which provides insight into things like the difference between funding levels for students from low-income households and students from non-low-income households. You can see from this chart just really quickly that the gap to fully funding our schools that are serving most of our low-income students is about twice the size of the gap for serving our non-low-income students. That's really why there's this huge equity imperative to fund the formula. And these dynamics exist across race and ethnicity lines as well. So we do see that we have larger gaps to full funding for our Black and Latino students than for white students. And another dynamic that we can look at is regional trends. I don't have that chart in front of me, but an important thing to note is that we do have huge gaps for both our rural students and students who are in kind of highly populated urban areas. So this is a statewide issue, which is why we're excited that the data does seem to show that the formula is an effective way to drive progress and make change, as long as the state actually appropriates funding for it. I know that was a long answer, but I hope that provided a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. And I think having the graphs and the pictorial representations is really helpful. For me anyway, it's hard to just listen to numbers. So that was very helpful. Thank you. And it seems like based on the formula, we've come a long way. Like you said, there's still a long way to go. I was kind of looking around online at what's been written, and I found the Making the Grade report from the Education Law Center. And one of the things that it pointed out was that the slow pace and increases to the formula means that students in the poorest districts aren't going to get to full and adequate funding for like 4 decades. And while Illinois is doing a good job with the amount of funding it's providing to students on average, it's well above the national average in how much we spend on students. The equity piece is still lagging behind. So Illinois is still kind of at the bottom of the list of states when it comes to, actually funding more for, kids who are not in high poverty districts, and sending less money to, the districts that have more kids who are below the poverty line and need additional supports and resources. So help us understand, I think, those data came from before the pandemic, but after the new formula, how are we still so inequitable, and kind of how do we move forward from there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a lot wrapped up in the way that some of those calculations are done that I think kind of sheds light on some of those answers. So first I'll say that, the averages that the Education Law Center's report kind of uses do pull together local and state funding sources into the same number for those kind of A ratings that show how much we're investing in Illinois students, which, it's great that that's a high number, but a lot of that is really being driven by local investment. And we know that when you average that all together, we're not seeing the vast differences in the fact that, some districts are spending a ton on students because they do have that local property wealth, where others are unable to, kind of back to that chart that we showed with the kids. And the interesting thing about Illinois is that we as a state still rely very heavily on local property taxes to fund education overall. So as of fiscal year 2020, the breakdown of funding sources for Illinois public schools reflected that 66% of all of our education funding revenue was coming from local sources. That's 2/3 coming from kind of local property taxes. And less than a third, or 27%, was coming from the state, with the remaining 7% coming from the federal sources. When we look at the national average for where public school revenues and funding comes from, it's much more balanced. So you really see, when you look at that national average, 45% of revenue coming from the state, 45% coming from local sources, and just under 10% coming from federal sources. So I think it's kind of important to recognize that that's what's driving a lot of the inequity in our system. We don't see that when we kind of ball everything up into one average, but it also does show you why we get the F in the kind of equitable distribution column. And my hope is that if you actually break that out, and we have seen this with the new funding formula, if you just look at state funding and the way that it's been distributed through EBF, it is not regressive. It is much more progressive and much more equitable, and is going in the vast majority to districts that serve the most low-income students. So I think it's a useful piece of data, but if you break it down, just looking at state funds, we're moving in the right direction, but it is going to take a very long time to get there. And it will require funding from the state to do that.
Thanks, that's helpful, and really interesting to note that that Illinois does rely on the local funds so much more heavily than other states, which contributes to this problem. So Dr. Lane and Dr. Patterson, talk to us a little bit about how the funding in your districts has changed as a result of the new formula. Dr. Lane, you want to start us off?
Sure, and I'll kind of echo Melissa's thoughts there. I mean, it's not perfect, but I'm telling you, it's so much better for us at least than what we had before. You know, I guess if you've been starving for a month, once you eat a little bit, you feel pretty good. You know, you don't complain too much. You know, we're a district that is heavily reliant on state funding. We have a very low property tax base, and we receive around 60% of our funding from the state. Before evidence-based funding, we were at 51% of adequacy, so about half of what we're supposed to get. So from 2012 to 2017, we lost right at $1 million due to the proration of GSA. So when we started off with EBF, we were identified as one of the least adequately funded districts at 51%. After 1 year of EBF, we raised up to 56%, year 2, 59%, year 3, 62%. Year 4, we stayed at 62% because it was flat. And then this year we were up to 65%. So even though we are now only funded at 65% of adequacy, we still feel so fortunate compared to where we were back in 2012. And people say, well, you're still only, you know, you're really far away. You're getting 65% of what you should get. And we're saying, we'll take it. You know, we now have hope for our future because of EBF. You know, it's way better than proration for us. And it's solely because we were so reliant on the general state aid before. And, you know, when you're in a rural area with very low property wealth, you are solely dependent on that state aid. You know, whenever that aid gets cut, it doesn't really affect all districts the same. You know, and so if you're not relying on state aid, when they cut it, it doesn't really affect you much because you still have your local property wealth. So that just really exacerbated the problem for rural school districts who have very low tax bases.
Thanks. Dr. Patterson, how about you?
So I am in South Cook, and South Cook is the largest region in the state, but we also have the highest concentration of poverty. And so we've been underfunded. Our district, just like surrounding districts, have been underfunded for decades. In 2011, when I became superintendent, our fund balance was $3 million. Currently, it's 26. We were deficit spending to the tune of $2.5 million. 36% of our budget is dependent upon the evidence-based funding. We have grown from 57% adequacy to 64% as of today's dates. And our operating costs have increased. At one point, it was $5,000 per student. We're up to $17,000 per student. So those are the good things. We've been able to hire interventionists. We are hiring math, technology coaches, math interventionists. So the monies have absolutely been beneficial. The biggest benefit has been our ability to hire, to be able to negotiate for a higher salary to attract better talent. Because when you want to start, if you want to start talking about equity, then especially in the classroom, talent does impact equity for our students. And so these monies have positioned us so that at least we're in a position to attract better talent and to provide better resources for our student. But, you know, in terms of equity, it should be a level playing field for our student, for all of our districts. And that is just really the reality of where we should be. When we start talking about adequacy, equality, and equity, it should be a level playing field, and it's not. And we lose generations. The longer it takes us to reach adequacy, the more generations we lose, because the playing field isn't level, and we are producing students who are not able to compete with their peers. And that should matter. That should not just matter to those of us in those districts. That should matter to everyone, because the goal is to have a society where everyone is a functioning and productive citizen. And so that I'll step off of my soapbox.
I mean, well, I may welcome you back up there, Dr. Patterson, because we really do want to hear more. I mean, both of you have talked a bit about what the new funding has meant for your districts, but we'd love to dig even deeper to hear even more about how the new formula, more broadly has really impacted your districts and the different facets of your districts, as well as a bit more even specifically about how it's impacted your equity work. And feel free in talking through that. I know Dr. Patterson, you already touched on that a little, but to really it'd be great to hear even more about some of the work that your districts are doing in this area, and specifically how the funding formula has impacted that work. Dr. Patterson, I know you're already on a roll there. If you want to continue, maybe expand on anything, we'd love it.
Yeah, so I think so. As Dr. Lane mentioned, we've dealt with proration for years, and so when you were dealing with proration, that proration has negatively impacted credit ratings and fund balances for a lot of districts. Ours, of course, was included in that. So the piece to remember, in my opinion, related to evidence-based funding, is that it provides for stability and sustainability in funding. Right now, we're at $350 million. We, as Dr. Lane says, we're not going to balk at the monies, but it needs to be more. It needs to be increased. We need to decrease. We still need to decrease our class sizes in our district. There are still some challenges we have with filling. Now, everyone now is experiencing gaps as it relates to instruction, because there are teacher shortages, there are substitute teacher shortages. So let's say prior to the pandemic, we had the need to provide more resources to our students. And that, of course, comes when you have the monies available to do things of that nature. And so as it relates to the equity component, as I mentioned previously, we have been able to include some resources such as the math interventionist, the reading interventionist, and the technology coaches, but we still need to decrease class size, increase the teachers, and increase those resources in order for there to be equity. We were able, and we have been able with the additional funding to provide technology, but the ESSER's money really assisted us with that one-to-one component. And since I mentioned that, let me just say, and I know we'll discuss it, those monies are earmarked. Those ESSER's monies, everyone is happy now because we've got a flood of federal monies coming into our districts. But those monies are earmarked specifically. They will not, and they are not meant to provide sustainability and stability in funding. The evidence-based funding provides stability. That allows us to be able to project, to do 3 to 5 year projections related to staff and students on what resources we'll be able to provide moving forward. When we were dealing with proration, every year was a struggle in trying to figure out, are we going to have enough staff? What about additional resources? What about after school programs? What about summer school programs? What about before school programs? What about food services? All of that has been impacted by this additional funding that we've been able to provide to students. And all of it provides equity for our students who don't have the needs. They don't necessarily have the support that other districts have. So when you're talking about, we're tier 1 district, tier 4 districts, we speak a different language. And I have a lot of friends who are in that position, but the language is different because the support for those students, they had that support at home. It's important to note that we provide a lot of support in school and after school. So this year, for instance, we're providing a dinner In addition to breakfast, we also do lunch. We're now doing dinners. We've been able to do that because I have stable funding that allows me to expand my food service program. So those are examples of what we are dealing with when we talk about equity for students. And it just should not be a battle. It is harder than, in my opinion, it should have to be, because everybody talks about children first. Everyone talks about the importance of children, but yet we don't match that with our actions. So, I just think that we just have to continue to focus with our politicians on the importance. And so whenever I engage in these discussions, I do mention this. Remember when I stated that at the very beginning, when I initially became superintendent, our fund balance was at $3 million. So we've written competitive grants just to be able to supplement our fund balances to provide resources to students. Now that's a good thing, but it shouldn't have to be such a struggle each and every day. So, okay, I think that's enough for now.
Thank you for all of that.
Yes.
Dr. Lane.
Sure, and I echo those sentiments, absolutely. During the years of proration, like I said before, we were unable to replace teachers, update our curriculum, purchase new textbooks, or really add anything of substance to our budget. Literally barely keeping our heads above water financially and just trying to survive. We ended up having to take out a $1.5 million line of credit in FY16. So really our first priority when we started getting some money back was to get out of debt caused by proration and try and restore most of the things we haven't been able to do during the proration years. I remember when we started to get that money and our local politicians were like, well, we just gave you this money. When are the test scores going to go up? And I'm like, well, as soon as we get out of debt caused by not getting money from the state from the last 3 years, so that was the first thing we had to do was get out of debt. But really the investment by the state and EBF allowed us to start adding back teachers that were not replaced due to retirements. Class sizes went way up. The money allowed us to start thinking about the future instead of worrying about how we were going to survive. And if there are superintendents from similar high poverty districts on this webinar today, you know what I'm talking about. The investment by state and EBF allowed us to exhale for a change instead of trying to decide what was the next area we had to look at to save money. And we shouldn't have to do that. One of our biggest issues in the area of teacher recruitment, and specifically minority teacher recruitment, right? I mean, it's impossible, especially down in this area of the state. I said earlier, our school district had about 20% minority enrollment, but we had 0% minority teachers, 0. So finding high quality teachers, and specifically minority teachers, was and is a huge priority for us. Our state is suffering from a severe lack of supply of teachers, especially in this part of the state. Who would have ever thought that we would have increased dollars flowing to our districts through EBF to add teaching staff, but no candidates to fill those positions? There's some real irony in all that. We were lucky enough to hire one minority PE teacher this year, so there's a start. But obviously we have a long way to go to make sure our minority students get the opportunity to be taught by a person of their color, just like the majority of our students get each and every day. We have to be able to do that.
Thank you guys for sharing all those. We did just get a question. If you guys have been talking about proration, and just for anybody who's less familiar with some of these funding processes, if one of you guys could talk us through what that means and how that worked.
Sure, I can take it real quick.
Yeah.
Basically, the state would tell us what we were supposed to be getting in state aid, and they would not give it to us. They would say you're going to get $4 million, and they'd only give you 2.5. And then they wouldn't tell you until about halfway through the year sometimes.
And then the payments, don't forget that.
And then even the money they gave you was delayed.
Yes.
I think no one can speak to that probably better than a district superintendent or a district leader. I think the other important thing for me to understand about proration is that, it was across the board cut. So to something both of you have shared already, like if you're a district that relies more heavily on state aid, then an across the board percentage cut in the amount of funding you get from the state, which is technically what proration entailed, means that the districts that rely most heavily on state funding saw the biggest dollar amount cut. So it just was the most inequitable way really to try to kind of claw back dollars.
I'll never forget Governor Quinn saying that this is shared sacrifice and all the districts need to understand that. And I'm sitting there saying, now, wait a minute. If I get 60% of my state from the state and you're prorating all at the same level at 50%, why is that, or how is that shared sacrifice? If one district gets 1% of their aid from you and I get 60%, that doesn't add up, so that just didn't work.
And typically it impacted the final payment of the year for those who are trying to wrap your mind around it. So for instance, we would receive our first, second, third payment. Always that fourth payment had to be prorated, which basically meant that you dealt with no monies towards the end of the year, and you are scrambling to try and figure out where and how your bills are going to be paid to your vendors and partners. And then we started the new year with the fourth payment, which basically means that you're still we were always playing catch up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we always had a pretty good idea what we were going to spend. We just didn't know how much revenue we were going to get.
Right.
Another thing I think that is kind of relevant here is that knowing that those were the conditions that happened when there was insufficient state aid, the legislation that created EBF does also include a clause that recognizes, like, we're talking about equity, that was the most inequitable way that you could design a reduction in state resources. So what EBF does is it includes a clause that says that if in the future we find ourselves in such a terrible financial situation as a state that cuts are unavoidable, they have to happen in not a regressive way, right? So we have to cut the least or none at all from our neediest districts. So
that was a key part of the legislation that was added, that all those first wave from adequacy would get funded first, which was exactly the opposite of what GSA was. So yes, you're absolutely correct. That was a key part of the legislation.
Yeah, so helpful. Thank you guys for that explanation. And Dr. Patterson, you had talked a little bit about the ESSER funds, and I know, federally we've gotten all this COVID relief funds, and people have been really happy about that and said, okay, we're good now. And you've talked a little bit about how those, it's a one-time thing, it's not sustainable. Can you just explain a little bit more the impact of that and what that means for what you need from the state still?
Yes. So the beauty of the ESSER funds for districts like my district is the fact that we have been working on construction and facility upgrades for a number of years. One of the oldest school in our district was built in 1957, but we've not had the monies to update and upgrade air conditioning, classrooms, windows. We've just not had the money. So the ESSER's monies that have poured in, we initially ensured that we were able to close the digital divide. So we ensured that all students had devices. We ensured that we had more than a plethora of hotspots for those students that were remote, because we remained open with about 35% of our population last year. And so then we moved into looking at facility upgrades. And so we have used the majority of our money. We've received $19.7 million. When we finish, roughly 17.5 million will have gone to upgrades. Every single school in our district is in the process or either has or will receive facility upgrades. And then, so this is my whole point. The monies have been earmarked. Majority of us have earmarked them specifically for facility upgrades, not for operational and instructional costs. I've been very clear about ensuring that those monies are earmarked for those projects. And so we still need to be able to provide additional interventionists. We still need to be able to purchase textbooks. We still need to be able to maintain staff and provide adequate staff for our students. My fear I think a lot of our fears is that our representatives will see the monies coming in and think that we have an influx of cash. And so then I was very thankful that Governor Pritzker was able to sign off on our receiving the $350 million for evidence-based funding, because that is a fear, and this is still a fear moving forward. These monies will not last forever. So we need to make sure that we don't mix the pots of money. And I've spoken to several superintendents who are intent on not mixing those pots of monies. And so we just need everyone, the powers that be in Springfield, to realize that these monies are temporary. And we're talking about stability and sustainability. And these monies were never intended for those purposes. So we purchased the devices, right? But we've got to be able to sustain them. We've got to be able to sustain, when you have staff increases, you have to be able to sustain them. So, I mentioned the fact that we added technology coaches and interventionists. We're able to sustain those with our evidence-based monies. If those are items that if those are positions that we're paying for with esser's money, at some point those monies are going to go away, and so are those positions, because they're linked to temporary money instead of money that is stable within the budget.
Got it. Dr. Lane, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Well, the federal dollars have really helped us as well. It's enabled us to heavily invest in technology. We were finally able to become a one-to-one school, which is something we wanted to do for a long time, but we just couldn't afford to do it. We've added additional ELA and math teachers, added a social worker, 2 custodians. We've added clear touch, interactive panels in almost every classroom, along with all kinds of other technology upgrades, just things that we never could do before. We now have after-school tutoring 3 days a week with a meal and with transportation, things we couldn't do before. We also now have a very robust summer school credit recovery program to catch up students who really have learning loss due to remote learning. It's truly been amazing for us to be able to offer our students the same type of advantages other students in more affluent districts utilize every day. But with all that being said, it's critical school districts continue to advocate for an increase in EBF each year. At a minimum, we need the $350 million that has been allocated recently by the state. It's critical we emphasize the reality that the federal dollars are short-term investments in our districts. If a school district hires several new staff with the federal dollars and then doesn't have any money to sustain those salaries once the last of the federal money is gone, which I think is December of 24 with the ARP money that has to be allocated by, what have they really gained? Sure, the short-term help for students is great, but good luck trying to explain to your parents, your community, why you can no longer offer after-school tutoring or expanded summer school. We had it for 3 years and now we can't do it. So please, please, please continue to advocate for yearly increases in EBF. We still have a long way to go before all school districts are adequately funded.
Thank you both so much for sharing your experiences and insights. Melissa, kind of in light of what Dr. Patterson and Dr. Lane shared, we understand that there is a body that continually reviews how the formula is working and considers any potential changes to the formula. So what can you share with us, about what would be beneficial to know about what could be coming next?
Sure, and it's a great question. So with the passage of the state's new formula, one of the additional things that was in the legislation was the creation of a body, like you mentioned, which is called the Professional Review Panel, PRP for short. And that panel is responsible for continually updating and evaluating the formula to really make sure that it's reflecting the real costs of providing a high quality education. And also just to ensure that the formula is actually working as it was intended to make progress towards adequately and equitably funding all schools. And I think part of the reason that this body was formed, honestly, was just as a reaction to one of the major pitfalls of the old system, being that it didn't update. So it became stagnant over time and didn't reflect changes in cost. It didn't reflect, changes in inflation, and it didn't reflect updated research on, what improvements and inputs actually matter and move the needle for our kids. So what the PRP does is that one of the things it's charged with is just on an annual basis, updating some of the dollar amounts associated with the cost of adequacy in the formula to really make sure that nothing is stagnant, that we actually are reflecting changes in costs as time moves forward. From an equity perspective, there are a couple of other really big things that the PRP is charged with. The first one is called an evaluative study. And the point of that is really just to understand the impact that the formula has had on Illinois districts since the law's passage. So every year we can run things like, what's the percent of new dollars going into the formula that's going to districts that serve the most low-income students, that's going to districts that serve the most students of color, that's going to districts that are below the median for property wealth. You can kind of see all of those different metrics of equity. What the evaluative study is going to do is kind of at every 5-year mark since the passage of the formula, provide that type of analysis to really show where the money is going. Is it going where we would want to if we are actually kind of sticking to the goals of an equitable system? One of the things I will say is that COVID threw a wrench in the works of any kind of quantitative data analysis. You know, it's really hard to track causes and effects when you have a giant pandemic at the middle of everything that interrupts your assessments and, much more importantly, interrupts the lives of your students and their families. So I think a lot of the quantitative data in that evaluative study is going to be difficult to track. And as Dr. Lane mentioned, you know, outcomes that would be affected by this type of funding take a really long time to move anyway. But I think what we will see is in the qualitative portion of that study, ISB and the PRP are working really hard to make sure that they talk to school and district leaders and they talk to educators and really try to understand what the impact of the dollars have been in their districts and how they're using it to move the needle for equity. So kind of exactly what this conversation is today will be the interview data that is used to try to gauge the impact of the formula in that study. And then every 5 years, it's going to essentially be repeated and updated. The second thing or big thing that the PRP is working on right now is also really closely related to equity. So in early 2021, as part of the education omnibus package that was created by the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, the PRP was charged with considering several issues that could potentially impact the formula going forward. And so that group is working on submitting a report. I think it's due by December 31st, 2021. And that's going to include findings on potential ways that the state could address a whole host of issues that the legislature identified. So that goes from, you know, does the formula capture the costs of providing foreign language to all students? Does the formula capture, or could it more accurately capture, the cost of providing supports to students in deep poverty or concentrated poverty? Because we know it might look different, and research actually says, you know, providing supports does look different for students who are in a district with 5 or 10% of students who are from low-income households compared to districts that are at 60 or 70 or 80 or 90%. So, you know, the formula at this point doesn't necessarily do that with as much nuance as it possibly could. And then the other big dimension that the group is considering is, are there ways that the formula could more proactively work to reduce racial inequity? So on kind of all of these dimensions, the group has conducted research and will present those findings to the General Assembly in a report. And then it'll be up to, you know, General Assembly to kind of figure out, how would you operationalize these things? What makes sense to kind of move forward on any of these findings? So we're really excited to see what comes out of that, and we'll be following it closely.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that detailed breakdown, and we will look out for those reports as well. You know, as we're approaching, you know, the top of the hour here, you know, I may ask Dr. Patterson and Dr. Lane, you've already, you know, shared so much about your experiences with the formula and the changes, but what still is in need for your districts. But if you could share maybe any sort of, you know, lessons learned or insights or tips that you have, especially for those administrators who are watching and listening today, you know, for best utilizing the funds that you do have, especially to support the equity efforts in your district. Dr. Patterson, anything to share on that note?
So I think what comes to mind for me is, so it's easy to prepare for equality. It's easy to ensure that we do the same for all students, right? The challenge is looking at programs, practices, and procedures when they really need to benefit the needs of each individual child. That then becomes a challenge. And so I just encourage my colleagues to reflect, get their data, because that's what we've done. We've had to collate our data, to look at the evidence to show that the practices and the programs we have that have been inequitable, that actually don't meet the individual needs of children. That is a separate conversation, and that one is a little more detailed. But the conversation should happen. So I'm impressed when the conversation is actually occurring in districts as it relates to funding. Everything you got to go from the programs in each district. You're looking at the practices in terms of behavior, in terms of discipline, in terms of instruction. Everything needs to be looked at differently with an equity lens versus the equality lens. And so that is the challenge. And so that is the challenge in looking at how we're spending our monies. Are we spending them in an equitable manner as well as an equal manner? So that would be, I would encourage the conversation, to be honest with you, because the conversation has not occurred in a lot of boardrooms, a lot of district offices, and of course, a lot of classrooms.
Dr. Lane?
Sure. I would say what we've tried to do here is involve a lot of people in the process. You know, make sure you're including your staff, your teachers, all your administrative team, you know, a member of your board, your community. You know, try to get some input as to what they think you need. I'm a big believer in best practices. You know, I like to say there's really no secrets in education. There's a lot of good things people are doing, and you need to get out of your office and go see them, you know, and figure out what's working. You know, now that we have a little bit of money to play with as far as ways to change things, we need to spend it wisely, you know, but get out there and see what's working, and try to do that to help your school. The other thing I like to piggyback off of is whenever when Dr. Patterson talked about equity and knowing what's best for kids, I think the frustrating thing for a lot of schools down here in the southern part of the state is knowing what we should be doing, but still not being able to do it, you know, because we can't find the people to do it. You know, people talk about hiring instructional coaches, all these different things. Guys, we can't even hire teachers. You know, I mean, it's just not the same. You know, I'm not sure where these people are going to come from. We have got to find a way, and there's progress being made with things like Golden Apple, and there's all kinds of alternative ways now to get into teacher ed, you know, but we've got to increase the supply of quality teachers. If we don't, all this money isn't going to do us any good. If we can't get quality people in our classrooms to help our kids and our teachers, it doesn't matter, you know, so that's a big part of equity right there. Other districts can do that. Other districts I see are hiring all these additional people and hiring all these getting all these resources to add in the classrooms, where we're just trying to hire a science teacher, you know, somebody that's certified. And it's not like we don't have the money. I mean, we probably have the highest salary of teachers in my whole area, and we still can't find teachers. So what are those other 10 high schools within an hour of me doing that paid less than I do? You know, so just keep that in mind when we're talking about equity. It's not that we don't know what we're supposed to do, it's that we can't, because we can't find the people we need. That's a reality.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lane, Dr. Patterson. Those are such critical and important issues really to highlight and keep at the forefront here. And thank you, Melissa, so much for walking through everything with us in a way that is accessible, and all the work that Advance Illinois is doing. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. You know, we're so grateful to you for sharing your experiences and insights with us. And we know and are grateful too to your welcoming. If listeners do have any questions or want to discuss issues related to school funding, our panelists have generously you know, invited you to welcome to reach out. So do please contact our guests, who are happy to continue the conversation. And if you do have any legal questions or concerns, please do reach out to any of our attorneys at Franczek, as always. And, you know, we also just want to say we really appreciate our audience and all of your engagement over the last year. A reminder that you can share this session and prior sessions in our Educational Equity Monthly Series with your colleagues. And the recordings are available on the Franczek website under events, as well as on our Education Law Insights podcast. And we do have sessions that are dedicated to particular topics such as special education, student discipline, English language learners, and hiring and retention, a lot of the issues that have been touched on today, among other topics specifically focused on educational equity. So while this is the final webinar of our equity series for this year, we look forward to continuing to talk and work with you on these critical issues and to hosting webinars on these topics in the future. So thank you all for being part of this effort and for the work that all of you are doing to educate all students day in and day out. So thank you.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure and an honor. Happy
Thank
holidays.
you.